I'm really a guy who lives out in the woods. Don't have any of those special fancy titles. But I am a father, and I want my children to live in a Christian nation. And I want my children to live in a Christian nation.
Well, welcome back to The Lone Bulwark. I'm Stephen Wolf. Today, I want to reply to an argument that you've all heard before, and I've probably heard at least once a week for the last 3-4 years, probably longer. And it's something that's easily answered, but we can answer it in a simple way, or we can answer it in the complex way. And so, I'm going to do it the complex way. So we're going to do a little bit of that. What is the argument? It's something to the effect of, you want civil government to promote true religion, and therefore you want a confessional state with a national established church, and you're going to round up the Baptists and rebaptize them. Yeah, that's a sort of argument I've heard over and over. Now, if at this point someone is making that argument after everything that's been said in reply to that, or what has been even originally said by myself and others, I don't think this video is going to prevent them from saying it. Because many of those sorts of people, I'm convinced at this point, their entire apologetic, they're an apologetics person, or their entire work and appeal is to rely on other people's ignorance. That's something that, for me, I try not to do. I just have committed as a principle that I'm not going to rely on anyone's, their lack of knowledge of something for me to then prove and demonstrate or argue for something. So I don't do it. But that is a lot of the critics of Christian nationalism, of classical Protestant politics. I'm just convinced that many of them know that their arguments are bad, but they rely upon the ignorance of their own audience, or they're just ignorant themselves. Anyway, you hear that sort of argument all the time. That argument is, you want to promote true religion. Well, guess what? That means that you want a confessional state rebaptized. You want the extreme stuff. Every single Unitarian is going to be rounded up right now. And every single heretic and all those Baptists, and they're going to have all this dissenting. Yeah, you've heard that argument so many times. And of course, we deny that. The simple version of denying that is to say that actually, when you enter into politics, politics is a realm of prudence. It's a realm of contingency. That is, the means to ends are determined not only by the ends themselves, but the circumstances in which they operate. And the circumstances can include not only sort of denominational diversity and religious diversity, it can include your heritage, the sort of things that the people have adopted as if by second nature. So for, American history post-founding and well before, it was understood that there would be this broad sort of Protestant, at least originally, this broad Protestant toleration and religious liberty. It's like, in a sense, in our DNA, right? And I would argue again that it's in the sort of DNA of a lot of evangelicals, the extreme version of that after the Warren Court, and they just assume that to be normal. And that's what the founders envisioned, that you'd have statues to Hindu warrior gods in rural North Carolina. That's just something the founders would celebrate. Of course they would. Anyway, the point being is that when you enter into a political realm, into political action, when you have a magistrate or a Congress or whatever, and they're enacting laws, those laws have to suit the characteristics and circumstances of the people. So you can have a principle, you ought to promote true religion, which is the Christian religion, but then the way that you would go about doing that would be different in different places. And they could be even contrary. So you could have a place where you have church establishment, an established church, and you could even exclude the instituting other churches. So take like New England, Puritan New England. They said, hey, we're going to Boston to found this colony and have this city of Boston and a few others, towns, and we're going to be based upon the Congregationalist way. All of a sudden, people show up uninvited who are not Congregationalists, and the Congregationalists say, look, we think you're brothers in Christ. You can be members of our churches, but you can't start your own church. Sorry, Baptist. But Baptist, and they did this, Baptists could be full members of the Congregationalist churches in Boston, right? They just couldn't start their own churches. So I think all that's perfectly justified. Now, if you fast forward 200 years or even 100 years, that looks increasingly absurd or difficult, not because the principle violates the principle, but because the application, the prudence, they've learned that actually, you know what, we can get along with the Baptists. We can form a civil union that is strong and robust, it's orderly, it's moral, by recognizing each other's mutual Protestant faith. And so in that sense, the principle is still the same, that true religion ought to be promoted, except that the arrangements have changed because of experience, prudence, circumstances, characteristics of the people. So things can change and still actually meet the same principle, okay? That's like the simple version, and that should be good enough for most people. But the more complex way to understand this, I'm going to enter into the discussion of genus and species, and this will be good. So by genus and species, that's a form of material logic. I know usually when we hear that, we think of like biological classification or taxonomy, but forget all that. We're going into the understanding of genus and species in terms of logic. And this is important, so this is not just me trying to fill time. So if you think of it like a genus is something that contains various species. So you can think of like the genus animal. The genus animal contains dogs and cats and cows and humans. Now, humans are distinguished in species by the fact that we have rationality. All the other animals are non-rational animals. Nevertheless, they're still species of the same genus. Now, what does that mean? Is that in everything that is true of something as a genus is also true of the species, right? So there's animality. We share that. Fido or Fluffy or whatever that's over there, right next to you, you share a certain characteristics of being with those other animals. And you share precisely, at least in the essential side, you share features that are common to you per the genus. Okay? And so then you have various species, but species amongst themselves have essential differences. We have rationality. My dog does not have rationality. All right, so those are the difference at species. And then you can get down to the level of like individualization. So you have members of species, like I'm a member of the human species. You're a member of the human species, I assume, unless you're the government, which means you're actually, I guess, a lizard. But other than that, you guys, we all share, we're members of that species. All right, what does this have to do with the topic at hand? I will get to that. I'm getting to it now. So when we say that government ought to promote true religion, we're saying that the government ought to act, okay? We can think of that as at the level of genus, right? That principle, that level of act, or the act at that level, we can call it the act of its act in terms of its genus. And that would be promoting true religion, okay? We can say that the genus of the act is necessary, as in magistrates ought to act to promote true religion in terms of the genus of act. Okay, hopefully this will explain, if you're not clear, this is important. But then you get down to the level of species of promotion. So we're talking about the civil government promoting true religion. And so within the available species, you have things like suppressing blasphemy. You have something like church establishment. You have something like having, proclamations like Washington had on like Thanksgiving proclamations, things like that. You could even have reforming a heretical church. You could have something like silencing heretical ministers. There's all sorts of things that are species to that genus. Now, part of doing political theory, I think Christian political theory, I think it's just political theory. You don't have to get to the Christian part a little bit later, but just part of doing political theory is determining the sort of limitations of the available species in the genus. Okay, so by which I mean what is not a moral species of that genus would be the magistrate assuming for himself the keys of the kingdom, or administering himself the Lord's Supper, or preaching the word, or, and in my view, because I'm a Scottish Presbyterian, he should not order the ordination of certain individuals, nor the defrocking of individuals. He cannot order the excommunication of certain individuals, nor can he lift an excommunication of certain individuals. Those are all forbidden, immoral acts per the genus.
I've been having a problem with my friend Ben.
That's raw Ben nationalist to you.
I'm sorry, my friend Raw Ben Nationalist. See, he doesn't trust those big box soap companies with all their nasty chemicals.
That's right. Gotta keep my T levels high.
Right, which has led him to do things like not shower for days at a time. But luckily, I just got some of that new Indigo Sundry soap.
Ew, keep that away from me.
No, Ben, this soap is different. It's made from all natural ingredients and none of that nasty, harmful stuff. And so now my friend Raw Ben Nationalist here.
That's Mr. Sir Reginald Ben Esquire III. Thank you very much.
So now Mr. Whatever his name is can shower in confidence. And so can you if you head to indigosundrysoap.com and pick yours up today. And hey, if you subscribe to any of their bundles or soaps, you get an automatic 10% off all your orders.
Delightful.
Okay. This is Dave. Dave is dead. When he wasn't, he was a successful businessman with a rather large estate. This is Ben. As Dave's son, Ben has just inherited a logistical nightmare. Dave wasn't exactly organized with his estate. Sorting through folders, receipts, and records, a hunting lodge in Montana, a 401k, lots of investments, several bank accounts, and of course, taxes. Ben was overwhelmed. Enter Joe Garrissey of Backwards Planning Financial. When Ben called Joe and explained everything, Joe replied,
"No problem. That's easy."
And somehow it was. With Joe's guidance, Ben was able to put a robust financial plan in place which helped mitigate risk and bring order to the chaos, while building wealth, organizing his estate, easing the tax burdens, and cutting unnecessary costs. He helped Ben do something Dave never did: plan ahead. Starting at the end and working backwards, Ben now has a plan for his own family. Now his kids won't go through what he did when he eventually... Backwards Planning Financial. Start planning for your death before you're gone.
So there are bounded species of acts that a civil magistrate can do relative to the genus, which is promoting true religion. Okay, so again, genus, you can think of it as the genus of the act is promoting true religion. The species would be more kinds of acts, again, like suppressing atheism, perhaps even funding the building of a church building for worship, sometimes even funding church ministers themselves. Those are all different species of acts. Now, a fundamental difference between the genus and the species is that the genus is an absolute command. That is, it is a principle, a immutable fixed principle of civil power or for the magistrate. The magistrate must act per the genus to promote true religion. Okay? That doesn't mean, however, that all the species are absolute commands. That doesn't mean that he has to do everything that is possible within the limits of the genus, that he doesn't have to, suppress heresy. He doesn't have to go into a church and silence the heretic. He doesn't have to do that just simply because he must, as a general principle, promote true religion. Why is that? Because one is a principle, one is a moral duty in the abstract sort of thing, or you could say as genus again. But species themselves, the species of acts, when they pertain to politics, are realms of prudence. They're realms of means to ends. They are, and the means are contingent. That is, they are appropriate given the circumstances. Because in certain circumstances, those means actually don't conduce to the end. That is, they don't actually promote true religion. Imagine if, think of it this way. I affirm with John Calvin that civil government ought to promote true religion. I share with him that principle. We both affirm. But that doesn't entail that I then have to seek for the United States at the national level or even at the state level to implement the law book of 16th century Geneva, or to do the sort of things that Calvin expected of civil magistrates in 16th century Geneva. It doesn't follow. It's not logically necessary. There's no entailment to that. And in fact, if I did that, let's say we did that even 200 years ago in America, it would likely overthrow the entire country. It would cause civil war. It would cause civil disruption. Why? Because it would be impossible to implement. The attempt in itself would suffer so much resistance that either the state would be overthrown, there'd be civil war, there'd be disruption, churches would be destroyed, things would go really bad. That is why the species of acts are prudential acts. They enter into a realm of contingency and prudence. Now, all of that can be true and still say that every single civil magistrate, regardless of the circumstances, ought to promote true religion. Okay? That's just a really crucial point. This is something that, like the medievals, and then it was adopted by the early modern period to distinguish an act by its genus, species, and its individualization, or its like concrete act. And that helps you understand the more, you could say the moral classification or designation of acts, how they relate to contingency and prudence, right? That's just it. So the genus is absolute. That is, you must promote true religion. You must do acts that promote true religion. However, when you enter into concrete political circumstances, you ought not, most likely, do all of those things. You ought to do some of those things, and the way that you do some of those things in the individual action has to still meet the intended end. So we've gone from genus, species to individual acts. Okay, species is like a kind of acts, more particularized, you could say. Take like punishing heresy, or let's just do blasphemers or atheists or something like that. If we say, okay, in our situation, we ought to have a law that says atheism should be suppressed, right? That's a species of act, right? We're talking about the species pertaining. And so now we think about the individual level. That doesn't mean that we have to punish every single atheist or every atheistic comment, nor does it mean that when we punish, it has to be with the same severity every single time. It goes all the way down to the individual act of suppression and how you would go about doing that. Right? So if someone carelessly says something, or let's say it's like a joke they don't intend, and we still want to do something like, you shouldn't do that, it might be inappropriate for the civil government to do anything at all. It might be more appropriate that people around them are like, dude, that's not funny. And that's enough, right? So the whole point, I've explained this in 15 minutes. This might be a short video. So the entire point of promoting true religion is that when we get down into the concrete level of action, of political action or civil action, when we get down to that, it actually conduces to the end. Okay? Now, there are categories of things where you might say, like the species that you might say are actually necessary in every circumstance, every situation. Okay, so I tend to think that in nearly every situation, and I don't think every situation, I say nearly every situation, a magistrate ought to have Sabbath laws. That is, Sunday Sabbath laws ought to happen in every sort of circumstance. Now, when I say that, I'm not saying that it's a commanded via the genus. I'm saying that as a species of act, the act of having blue laws or Sabbath laws are in every set of circumstances, nearly, conducive to the end of promoting true religion, right? So I'm not then absolutizing the command at the level of genus, but at the level of species. Now, I know people might think that's a distinction without the difference. It is a distinction without a difference practically. I get that. I'm just trying to make sure we keep our levels in the right situation. I think far too often people who are establishmentarians tend to conflate sort of genus and species. Because even if you think that we must have church establishment, which I actually don't think in every set of circumstances you must have church establishment, but I have friends who do think that. And that's fine. I respect that position. But I think what we're doing though is that we have to understand that church establishment is not an end in itself. It's a means. It's a means to an end of promoting to religion. It's like in this set of circumstances or all sets of circumstances, church establishment is necessary to actually meet the command of the genus. Okay? I know good friends who like that. But I'm just saying that when we think about this, when we talk about it, we have to still understand that the end is not the church establishment. The end is it's actually a means to an end. And therefore, the moral designation of establishing a church has to still go through the same sort of reasoning, political reasoning, as whether or not you're going to punish heretics. You have just come to the conclusion that through political reasoning, that church establishment is necessary in every or nearly every single set of circumstances. So that's an important point to understand. And I mean, the other thing about establishmentarian people is they tend to treat it as an end in itself. I think that's just a faulty view of understanding. It's still, church establishment is a means. It is a means to an end. They also tend to think that that is kind of all that Christian politics is, that there's nothing actually more to it. And it's a sort of absolute command of God that there must be an establishment. Okay. Now, this is another point too on the same thing. Let's say that it is, because God could do that. He could say, you must have an established church in which there is a officially recognized church vis-a-vis the state. God can do that, of course. That's much of the Old Testament law is in fact him legislating things down at the species and individual level, right? I mean, actually at the species level. So God actually and applies the punishment. So much of the Mosaic law is literally God commanding acts at this level of species. Okay. So he could do that, but even in that case, God is absolutizing a species. He's saying you must do this at the level of species. So in other words, he's removing the necessity of political reasoning in the act and saying, by my divine law, you ought to do this. But it's still technically at the level of species. It's still technically a means to an end and not an end in itself in the realm of politics. Now, I think in this sense, I'll finish up with this. This is going to be a short video. This is another way to understand the idea of general equity in the Westminster Confession. When they say that the general equity of the laws are still applicable, what they're saying is that the principles behind those more specified civil laws, those general principles are still operative. So I said there, like, I've been talking about a genus that says promoting true religion. You could have a genus that says promote justice, just promote civil justice. That would be a different principle, and you could say it's a different genus or however you want to frame that. But those are at the general level. And so, yeah, a principle of government is that you ought to promote justice. Under that principle are going to be various species of acts that you must, that you in concrete circumstances may do, I should say. What this means is in the general equity, when you read the Mosaic the Mosaic polity and you read the Mosaic laws, part of what you're doing is you're reading them as commanded species of acts with a higher genus. And when the confession says applying the general equity, you're assuming the higher genus, or you could say the moral principle, and then you're applying it in concrete circumstances. So you can use the Old Testament law then as a means, not only means by which you can think of the principle, but also as, hey, this is a specific way in which you deal with or conduct this species of act. Or this is a particular way in which God commanded the Israelites to deal with this particular sin and render this thing a crime. Right? So in that sense, when it says general equity, it's universally binding to all nations. The principles are absolutes. They are principles that you ought and must apply. But to meet those principles depends upon the concrete circumstances, and it depends on political reasoning, deliberation, prudence, and then contingency of means to ends, and all that sort of thinking that goes into political magistracy or civil power, the application of civil power. So I think that's the proper way to understand that. What this means then is you could you can, discover the principle via the specified act in the Old Testament. And then you could say, well, actually, our circumstances are not that different from the Israelites. Like the Hebrews in Israel, it's very similar. So, that seems like an appropriate law. Like we ought to enact that law. That works. I mean, first of all, God enacted it, so it must be good for at least those people. But since we share similar characteristics pertaining to that sort of act, then we ought to implement that as well. So a lot of times you'll read like various early modern reformers on the law. Take like Genus and Mosaic Polity, the Mosaic Polity, which I recommend you read. He'll say that when God a Mosaic law requires the death penalty, right? When it's a sort of capital offense, that indicates something about the nature of the act itself, that the nature of the crime itself, the nature of the sin itself. If it's so serious that it warrants death, then that probably means that it's kind of universally detrimental to, civil order. That means every single civil order, when that sort of crime or sin occurs, that is going to be detrimental because due to the severity of the punishment. That's the sort of thinking. Which means this is why that people like Junius and Zanke and others will say, yeah, those laws probably most likely should be actually enacted everywhere. But the reasoning is not simply that God commanded as an absolute requirement per its species, but it's because we share the same contingency, we share the same circumstances that would render those sorts of crimes detrimental and therefore warranting the death penalty. So it's a different way of approaching it than a theonomist. So in a way, you can reach the same conclusion on certain matters with a theonomist, but then at the same time, for very different reasons. And I'll just say that what I've presented here is I've never seen that really even contradicted. I think the theonomists who claim like Rutherford at times, or they've claimed Gillespie at times, they've claimed John Cotton at times, what they don't really understand, they don't understand kind of what they're up to. They're up to precisely what I'm talking about. Even the ones who wanted to apply a broader range of the Mosaic law, they're recognizing, or I should say, they are assuming and affirming that there's far more universality regarding the circumstances in all civil polities that would then warrant a more extensive use of the Mosaic law as to the particular determinations by God for the Israelites. That is different than saying, well, God said it, therefore we ought to do it as well. Like there's a different sort of reasoning to get there. And I think that is pretty much what everyone is doing. Cartwright, I think, is doing that. Gillespie's doing that. Rutherford's doing that. John Cotton is doing that. And so the modern version of theonomy, to my mind, is just utterly modern. Like it misses the way people thought about civil law for millennia. And it just kind of makes it simple and this is it and that's that. So anyway, I'm sure I'll get theonomists respond to this and be upset, but I think that's very important. So again, let me just kind of recap a bit, summarize. So in any sort of act, you got the individual act, and then you have what kind of act that is, which would be species. And then you have a further kind or a higher kind, which would be the genus of the act. So every act has, you could say every moral act or immoral act, whatever, would have a like individualization act or act as an individual concrete act. And then you have the sort of act or kind of act it is at the level of species, and then you have it at genus. Now, you can have at genus an absolutized command. You ought to promote true religion in some way. In some way, according to the limitations of the genus, that is the possible species of acts that are moral per the genus, okay? Or moral per, I guess it would be per the genus. I guess the limitations are probably at the genus level that flow down. Anyway, whatever. All right, so, but at the species level, that is the sort of act that it is in amidst concrete circumstances, is something that you may not have to do, or even though it's morally permissible. It may not be prudent to say, we're going to take the Genevan Law Book and plop it down, into 21st century America. It may not be prudent. Why? Because it would actually violate the very end you're seeking. It would do the opposite. It would burn churches, overthrow this and that. Okay? Yeah, so, but then you get the realm of species, you have to evaluate. Is it, even though it's morally permissible for me to say, sorry, Baptists, we're just going to be Congregationalist only. That's it. You can be members of our church as Baptist, but you can't be, you can't start your own church. Is that a prudent action? Is that the sort of, would that be moral in application? Would it be right in application? That is, would it actually lead and lead to the end sought in it? Would it even meet the principle? No, it would not. It might be permissible per the genus and the principle, but it's not in itself. It wouldn't in effect be moral because it produces bad ends. Okay, but let's say we say, yes, we should have a Sabbath law. We should have Sabbath laws. That species of the genus is actually appropriate here and now. All right, so how are you going to enact that? How are you going to punish people who violate it? What if someone violates it by accident? Are you going to have exceptions for certain emergency services? What sort of businesses, given the sort of businesses we have today, are going to be available? Are we going to let Rite Aid and Walgreens stay open because they have pharmacies and that people might need medicine? All those things then have to come into consideration of the very particular circumstances. So the act of saying we're enacting a law has to be fit the actual circumstances themselves to meet the actual intent inherent to it. Are we going to say that, for example, like electricity, the power company can still have their guys ready to fix power lines because it's 10 degrees outside and someone could die if the power goes down through a storm? There's things like that then you have to consider, and then you have to create exceptions and a good policy. Otherwise, you're making an immoral policy because you're going to hurt people. People who need emergency services need that sort of thing. All right. So yeah, it enters into a realm of purpose or realm of prudence. Yeah. And so as we go forward, thinking about a Christian nation, there are basically, you think of like two general questions that are distinct, though related. The first one is a question of political theory, which is it true that all governments have a natural principle that they ought to promote true religion? If you deny that, then you can kind of just stop. Or if you might want to modify it, as like Pufendorf and John Locke and some particular Baptists will do, and they'll say that actually the principle is the government ought to promote natural religion. There are some guys, I think it's the Particular Baptist podcast or something like that. I think they affirm that. I think they affirm natural religion apart from revealed religion, right? I respect that position, by the way. I don't agree, but I respect that position. And practically, in terms of the American situation now, I don't see how that would ever change. Like that wouldn't change. Like we'd be allied on pretty much everything in the realm of practical politics. So it's great. Love to be allies with those people. You can deny the principle. That's what I meant. But then if you affirm that principle, then you get to the second question, which is, okay, what are the prudential actions that we can do given these circumstances now? Those are different questions. And that's actually, that question is more of a question for civil magistrates, because he is charged with the action. Now, of course, he can have counsel and he can have, you can have a Congress where they deliberate on these things. But when it comes to who's responsible for the prudential action, I mean, in a way, the citizens can like provide their input, they can elect people, but in the end, the one who acts is the civil government. So ultimately, that question of what ought we do now practically, prudentially, that is actually a question for the civil magistrate. Of course, we can talk about it all we want, but that's ultimately not our responsibility to act to meet that. All right, so hopefully I haven't thoroughly confused everyone, but I think that's just the better way to think about all these things in precise categories with, various distinctions so that we can think intelligently and think clearly about this stuff. Now, my critics, I would, if we got this stuff down, if we talked in these ways, the discussion would move forward much better, much better. Oh, I forgot one thing that I was going to say. So this is not my ending yet. The Westminster Confession, chapter 23 of the original version. This is very important. I meant to show it, but it doesn't matter. You can pull it up. So the Westminster Confession, the original edition, someone like Kevin DeYoung reads it as the civil magistrate must do these things, must do these things, must do these things, like take order, make sure the church is orderly, suppress heresy, that sort of thing. I think that's like a misreading to speak of it as a bunch of musts. I think what's happening is that it's 1640s England and Scotland, in which that is a possibility per species to accomplish. So when they say, and they probably wouldn't foresee a time when you couldn't do that, I guess. So what they're doing is they're saying essentially at the level of species, not the level of genus as an absolute must, they're acting on the level of species saying, hey, you can do this, you ought to do this. Okay? Whereas when I read it, I'm reading it with the distinction. So Kevin DeYoung's reading it as if those commands are absolute principles that must happen. They're like commands of the confession or commands of God that you must suppress all heretics, that you must enter into the church, take order of the church, that you must do all these things. I don't think that's a good reading because I've never seen any reformer, even the ones who are all like the Scottish Presbyterians, I've never seen them talk in ways that would make the species of acts absolute musts, that you have to do this in all circumstances. In fact, I've only seen the opposite. One great example is John Davenport's or Cotton, whoever, it depends on which anthology you open. There's the, what's it called? Discourse on Civil Government. He says right off the bat, he's like, look, the question of having a Christian state, to have that, it requires you to have a certain Christian number of Christian people. Like you can't have 1% Christians and somehow the Christian comes to power and all of a sudden you're going to start suppressing heresy and blasphemy and false religion. Like that's not going to happen. So across the board, to my reading, and I'd love to see someone show me something that contradicts this, they all affirm the sort of genus species distinction that I've already affirmed here. And so the confession is actually recognizing it's in a way, it's like you can view each of them of the sort of what appears to be a must as a sort of synecdoche of the genus, or you could say a species of the genus. And the entire point is you ought to promote true religion. So if you're in circumstances like in the American context where those sort of things aren't going to happen, then you treat them simply as species that are not morally permissible at that moment, given the concrete circumstances. And so this is my actual reading of the American version, which is what they are doing when they wanted to say, hey, you can't, you can't suppress heresy, or you should, allow people to conduct their religious assemblies without interference. I think what they're up to is they're just recognizing the American context. They're not denying the genus. What they're denying is saying that, look, our original confession is kind of unclear on the points because it seems to be suggesting musts pertaining to these species of acts. We're going to clarify and say, actually, we're going to, in a way, curtail that and say these various species of acts, such as the harassment of heretics, things like that, we're going to say, look, that's just not appropriate. That's how I read it. That's how I read it. And so it's not denying from Congress or state governors or state legislatures or the president, it's not denying that they may promote the Christian religion. It's simply saying, look, certain species of acts, which in principle would be morally permissible in certain situations, are actually not appropriate given the fact that we are Americans in the American context. So that's my reading of it. There's more to it than that as well. I think we'll end there. We'll end there right now. So thanks for listening. I hope this made sense. Please let me know if you want me to clarify things. I don't know. This can be complicated. I might have had an error in there somewhere. So cool. All right. Thanks for listening and bye-bye.